Welcome to this reading. This one, we're talking about football, or soccer, I guess, if you live in Australia or New Zealand or parts of South Africa, because I guess it's soccer in the other part of South Africa, or soccer, I guess, if you live in Canada or the US. This kind of looks like a giant Canada-US combo. In Ireland, they call it soccer, which is interesting. In England, they call it football. In Russian, they call it whatever this is. In Chinese, they call it this. In Korean, this. Oh, North and South Korea agree that football is both pronounced the same way. That's quite interesting. I guess soccer can transcend politics, which is what we're basically talking about today. This reading is called Global Goals. It's from the book World History Through Case Studies by historian David Eaton, and it was published in 2020. From 1948 to 1994, South Africa was ruled according to the system of institutionalized white supremacy known as apartheid. Competition between black and white athletes was forbidden, and this eventually led to international sanctions against South African sports teams. South Africa, by the way, is right here. That's what we're talking about. The release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and his victory in free and fair elections 4 years later represented a turning point. The sanctions ended, and in 1995, South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. Their subsequent victory was so dramatic that it became the subject of a feature film, Invictus. Pretty good movie. 9 years later, soccer's governing body, FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, chose South Africa to host the 2010 World Cup. Here is the logo for that World Cup. The World Cup is the most important soccer competition in the world. Each country can field a team comprised of their best players, and during periodic breaks in club competition, they compete in qualifying matches. If a nation is one of the 32 qualifiers, they are then invited to the World Cup. Qualifying positions are assigned to regional associations, ensuring that teams from all over the world attend. Held every 4 years, it takes place over 1 month, with games happening across the host nation. Massive audiences from around the world watch on TV, with the 2006 final between Italy and France attracting roughly 715 million viewers. FIFA rakes in enormous sums of money by selling TV rights and exclusive advertising deals to its corporate partners. For the host nation, a successful World Cup can lead to a surge in tourism and offers an opportunity to showcase the nation to a global audience. For Qatar 2022, the most recent World Cup as of this recording, soccer's global governing body says around 5 billion people engaged with the World Cup. Without defining that metric, FIFA said that figure was based on fans, quote, following tournament content across an array of platforms and devices across the media universe. The World Cup final match itself scored 1.5 billion global viewers, roughly twice as many viewers as the 2006 final here. Wow. This is a copy of the video game FIFA for Xbox 360. This is the one that I played the most. It's the 2010 FIFA World Cup version. When South Africa won the right to host the 2010 World Cup, many pundits worried that it would be a disaster. Some of their fears were sensationalistic, but lingering income inequality from the apartheid era, a tragically widespread HIV/AIDS epidemic, and dangerous levels of violence in many parts of the country were real concerns. I happened to be in Kenya during the World Cup, and I flew down to see a game between Algeria and the US. It was a gripping spectacle, with Landon Donovan scoring a stoppage time winner to ensure the United States moved on. After the game, both sets of fans mingled around the pitch, singing arm in arm despite the tensions that existed between the two nations. I then walked the mile back to my host family's house without ever feeling in danger. On that day, it was easy to believe that soccer was a global force capable of overcoming national, religious, or ethnic divisions, aka cultural globalization. Ultimately, the 2010 World Cup was deemed a success, and the once skeptical pundits lauded or praised South Africa for its impeccable or perfect performance as host. But there were also whispers that the 2010 World Cup might not have been such a wonderful accomplishment. The bidding process was marred by allegations of corruption, and the $3.5 billion spent on new stadiums and supporting infrastructure seemed problematic, given the large number of South Africans who continue to live in poverty. Was successfully hosting what is effectively a party for the global elite really worth such a massive price tag? This chapter examines globalization through the lens of progress and decline, and asks how historians should assess it. Is globalization a force for good, or do the costs outweigh the benefits? World historians, and many other academics, have a lot to say about globalization, deemed as the recent tightening of long-distance connections around the world and the subsequent creation of a global culture. Modern globalization represents an unprecedented level of economic and cultural integration, with corporate capitalism and migration chipping away at previous sacrosanct boundaries. Sacrosanct means like sacred boundaries, like nations, for instance. Without the advantage of hindsight, this is always going to be more difficult to assess than the distant past. Historians generally draw on two main theories to explain globalization as an example of progress, things getting better, or decline, things getting worse. One created by Francis Fukuyama, and the other by Benjamin Barber. Fukuyama's theory stems from an essay he wrote in 1989. Fukuyama argued that the West, represented by liberal democracies with successful consumer cultures, such as the US, had triumphed over its two main ideological rivals, fascism and communism. Since there was no obvious alternative remaining, this would lead to, quote, the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. While he was careful to state that this would happen in the long run, rather than in the immediate future, his argument was clear. The end of the Cold War, and with it the end of communism as a rival to liberal democracies, entailed, quote, the end of history. The future no longer would involve conflict on a grand scale, and instead focus on mundane economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. Thomas Friedman, columnist for the New York Times, expanded on these insights, arguing that information technology, and that is the internet, and globalization are leveling the global economic playing field. In this new, quote, flat world, a person's place of birth mattered less than their work ethic and skills. This perspective suggested that globalization is a positive change. Not all analysts were as optimistic as Fukuyama and Friedman. Benjamin Barber, in a famous 1992 article, argued that the future of the world would be shaped by two axial forces of tribalism and globalism. The first, which he labeled jihad, encompassed violence in the name of religion, nationalism, or ethnicity. So it's kind of like an extension of the nationalism idea that we've looked at throughout world history. The forces of jihad would emerge in opposition to the homogeneous, that is same, global consumer culture based on fast music, fast computers, and fast food. To Barber, this alternative future was McWorld, a reference to McDonald's and the McDonald'sification of the world, kind of like Coca-Cola colonization. What makes Barber's theory interesting is that he argues that both jihad and McWorld are threats to democracy. When it comes to jihad, this question is an explicit rejection of liberal and democratic values. But the corporate globalists, he contends, pose a similar challenge. Obsessed with efficiency and productivity, even at the expense of people's right to self-government, the technocrats of McWorld are guided by laissez-faire economics, more by laissez-faire economics than civic participation. Naomi Klein argues that this happened in South Africa during its famous elections that ended apartheid in 1994. Despite a clear popular mandate under the Freedom Charter to redistribute land and undermine white control, the ANC, the African National Congress, ultimately embraced a form of neoliberal economics that made these goals impossible and worsened inequality. Despite the overwhelming opposition of South African voters, the ANC was told, quote, the world's changed. None of that leftist stuff means anything anymore. This is the only game in town. So don't worry about inequality. Instead, just let the free market do its work. To Barber and Klein, globalization is not the victory of liberal democracy, but a new threat to it. After all, it's going against what the people want, right? World historians struggle to reconcile these divergent views of the post-Cold War world, our world. They recount with breathless enthusiasm the new global village being created as old national boundaries become obsolete. Economic prosperity, universal human rights, and a widening of cultural influences around the world also have real appeal to world historians. Fukuyama's narrative of democracy triumphing over fascism and communism, for example, deeply influences narratives of the 20th century. However, world historians acknowledge the significant negative impacts of globalization, like the persistence of extreme poverty around the world and the threat that the globalization of consumer culture poses to the environment. So, is globalization a force for good or a problem to be solved? One way of rendering these disputes visible is by zooming in on a specific aspect of this overwhelming phenomenon of globalization. This is where soccer, or football, fits in. Fun, cheap, and easy to learn, this sport has become popular all around the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, it arrived during the colonial era. European administrators, missionaries, and workers all introduced soccer to Africans, who in turn set up their own leagues and adapted the game to suit local cultures. When African nations gained independence in the 1960s and 70s, they often built large stadiums and directed significant resources to their teams as a matter of national pride. But African soccer remained on the margins of the global game until the end of the Cold War. Its integration into that space thus offers a lens into the impacts, both positive and negative, of globalization. Africa, soccer, and the global era. Following Fukuyama and Friedman, the argument that globalization is a force for good generally is connected to the belief that free markets can solve political or social problems. One example of this approach comes from Simon Cooper and Stefan Szymanski. In a chapter from Soccernomics, they use a regression analysis to uncover whether players of color were underpaid relative to their team's success. They found that in the 1980s, quote, black players were systemically better value for money than whites, likely because certain clubs refused to employ black players even though they were more talented than some of their white teammates. However, by the late 1990s, this changed drastically, and Cooper and Szymanski could no longer find any evidence that black players were undervalued. They argued that, quote, the economic forces of competition drove white men to ditch their prejudices. They attribute this to the transparency of the market. In a sport like soccer, the skill of the best players is quite evident in relation to their peers. If you want to field the best team, it needs to include the best players, regardless of race, ethnicity, or religion. And they believe it was no coincidence that teams became more interested in signing the best possible players in the 1990s, when television revenues for major European leagues skyrocketed, and the monetary rewards for winning championships increased accordingly. This was also the moment when international boundaries became more porous for players based in sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to the early 1980s, they rarely joined clubs in Europe. Visa rules, nationality restrictions in Europe, and the racism mentioned above ensured most African players stayed in African domestic, or home, leagues. The enormous sums paid by Sky Sports for the TV rights to the English Premier League in 1992, £304 million over 4 years, transformed the situation. Clubs in Europe now had far more revenue than clubs based in Africa, and could pay far higher salaries. The Bosman ruling of 1995 further enhanced player mobility by releasing them at the end of their contracts, allowing elite athletes to enter free agency. This, unsurprisingly, benefited the very best African soccer players. Stephen Pienaar, born in the impoverished townships of Johannesburg, the capital of South Africa, is a good example. After showing excellent form as a youngster, he was signed by one of the top clubs in South Africa, Ajax Cape Town, in 1999. They won the prestigious Rothmans Cup while he was there, but the team paid players poorly. One expose revealed that some of their starters received wages of the South African currency, which is the rand, 2,500 rand per month, roughly $350 per month. Ooh, that's not very much in the year 2000. Once he left to play abroad, however, Pienaar was able to earn far more, including the roughly £3 million per year he made at Tottenham in the English Premier League. As a high-profile South African player in the top European league, Pienaar even joined global megastar Lionel Messi as part of a major Adidas advertising campaign in the run-up to the 2010 World Cup. From the perspective of top African players, globalization offered new and unparalleled opportunities. European leagues paid the best wages in order to attract the best players and compete with other top teams. It is no surprise that the most talented African stars ended up playing there. Here's a chart showing the top 10 football clubs by market value. Number 1 is Barcelona. Number 2, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, Manchester United, Liverpool, Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal, PSG, which is a Parisian French team, and Tottenham. So Barcelona's in Spain, Real Madrid's in Spain, Bayern Munich is in Germany, Manchester United, Liverpool, Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal, and Tottenham are all in the UK in the English Premier League, and then PSG is in the French League. And this is of May 2021. Liverpool is worth a lot of money, as is Barcelona. The arrival of soccer migrants even reshaped European national identities, often in a more inclusive way. Laurent Dubois used the 2014 World Cup qualification campaign of the French national soccer team to illustrate these changes. Dubois observed that many young families from Francophone, that is French-speaking African countries, moved to France to escape poverty or conflict in their homelands. Their children often loved soccer, and as French citizens were eligible to play for the national team. Several did, including Mamadou Sakho, born in Paris to Senegalese parents, and Paul Pogba, born just outside Paris to Guinean parents. This team eventually had to win a two-legged playoff against Ukraine to qualify for the World Cup. Following a 2-0 loss in the first leg, right-wing politician Marine Le Pen blamed the defeat on ultra-liberalism in the sport. To her, quote, "There is a real rupture with the French people. A team can't be pushed forward only by the desire for monetary gain or individual egos. It has to be carried by the entire people." I wonder what she means by that. Her father and political mentor told the press that French coaches had, quote, exaggerated the players of color on the team, and that, as a result, the French people no longer felt represented by them. Who's French? To Le Pen, players of colors were not really French, and should not represent the nation, even if they were French citizens. Well, some had shared her sentiments at the time. France managed to win the return match 3-0 in front of a home crowd and qualified for the World Cup. Sakho, who had scored 2 of the goals, said the following after the match. Here he is celebrating after the match here. Quote, "I just want to say that players in the squad represent everyone in France, the multicultural society of France. When we represent France, we know we are playing for the multicultural French nation. We love France and everything that is France. I want the supporters to know that we really fight for that shirt. The cultural mix of France is represented in that squad, and we are determined to win the hearts of the fans by fighting really hard for the shirt. It's not a qualification just for 24 footballers in a squad, but for the whole nation. France is made up of Arab culture, Black African culture, Black West Indian culture, and white culture. And we say a squad that reflects multiculturalism are all fighting in the same way and are united behind France qualifying for the World Cup." So is this an example of nationalism or an example of globalization? Or both? It's hard not to get swept up in this type of infectious multiculturalism. Borders are breaking down, identities being reshaped, and everyone seems to benefit. But of course, this is not the whole story. Mamadou Sakho could just as easily have been playing for the Senegalese national team. The fact he is not reveals a key problem with global markets. In many cases, the rich get richer. No soccer-playing nation embodies the contradictions of globalization better than Senegal. A French colony until 1960, historic ties ensured many Senegalese players played their club football in France, lived in France, and then would fly home to Senegal during international breaks to play for the Senegalese national team. Thanks to the elite level of competition in France's top league, the quality of Senegal's team improved dramatically at the end of the 20th century. And in 2002, they qualified for their first ever trip to the World Cup. The team was promoted with the slogan, oh boy, French, here we go. I'm just going to do the translation, meaning the Senegal that wins. The team captain, El Hadji Diouf, said that, like, quote, the leader of a country, And when Senegal beat France 1-0 in their first World Cup match, fans again poured into the streets. One Senegalese supporter said, quote, "It was a victory for black people everywhere." The contradictions of globalization were embodied in players like Kalidou Fadiga. He left Senegal at the age of 6, grew up in France, and told reporters, quote, "I know the streets of Paris better than the streets of Dakar, the capital of Senegal." Fadiga's loyalties ultimately rested with his ancestral land, and he noted that, quote, "When I was home, everybody would speak our language, and we listened to Senegalese radio and music. I share both French and Senegalese cultures, but I have a lot of family over in Senegal, and my color is Senegalese." A profound irony lay in the fact that Le Sénégal qui gagne, the Senegal that wins, was primarily composed of people who had left Senegal. In a globalized world, the elite representatives of a nation might not spend much time there. Devish Kapoor and John McHale wrote an extensive study of brain drains in the global economy and included a brief section on soccer in Africa. They argue that the migration of Africa's best players to Europe had greatly improved the quality of African national teams, but they also noted that this denuded African domestic leagues of talent, since they offer competitive wages to quality players. This has led to smaller crowds, lower revenues, and even more out-migration by top players. If you're a good African footballer, you might not stay in Africa because of globalization. Is that good? Is that bad? Depends who you ask. Globalization offers no easy solution to this dilemma, and it appears that African club football will remain a poor substitute to the European version for the foreseeable future. Now, this article is a bit dated. This is a bit more up to date. This is information from 2022 and the 2022 World Cup, and it shows the share of players born in former French colonies in Africa on the French team and the share of French players born on the qualifying African teams. So, as we can see here, there's a lot more here in these later World Cups. So, globalization is a process that continues and still definitely affects our present world and the World Cup that we all just watched a few months ago. If you're listening to this in 2022, that is. The talent drain created by globalization affected more than just elite players. Raphael Poli, in a study dating to the 2002-2003 season, found that African players were overrepresented in Europe's less prestigious leagues, the worst ones. These European clubs offered African players low salaries, lower than those considered minimally acceptable to Europeans. The club knew that they could get away with this since the African players were desperate to avoid being sent home to even worse conditions. Poli concludes that, quote, "The transnational networks set up for the training, recruitment, and transfer of African players are almost always controlled from above and serve the needs of the European football economy more than the African one." These less prominent players were vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation. In 2011, 7 Zambian players were convicted of accepting bribes to fix matches while playing north of the Arctic Circle for Rovaniemi, a team in the Finnish league. Thanks to their relatively poor wages and the expansion of global gambling markets in Asia, they were ideal targets for match fixers, people who purposely lose games, who made roughly, €500,000 from this league alone before getting caught. The remaining black players in Rovaniemi then faced racial abuse in this tiny community. Definitely worth checking out the final match of the Qatar World Cup. It's one of the best football games I've ever seen. It's so good. And then also the dark side of the World Cup. These charts show where France's footballers are. 59 players in this year's World Cup were born in France. 37% of the players born in France are on the French team. But then there's a lot of people, French people, who play for Tunisia and Senegal and Morocco and Ghana and Cameroon. Why? Well, because of colonialism and globalization, perhaps. Here's a portion of players that are not born on the country of their team. So Morocco's got the highest. More than half of Morocco's players were born in another country, which is really interesting because Morocco did really, really well in this World Cup. Senegal, very, very high. 38% of the players on Tunisia's team were born in France. As you can see over here, lots of Senegalese and Tunisian French people playing on the Senegalese and Tunisian teams, which is all very interesting. Cameroon's on there as well. The U.S., 20%. And then that's 0 for Argentina, Brazil, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. As a final example of the hazards of globalization, it's worth returning to the 2010 World Cup. Today is generally seen as a success, with South Africa's deputy sports minister, Geertz Otsenhaide, claiming, quote, "We built stadiums and infrastructure. We were way ahead of schedule, everything went perfectly, everything was in place." But it was much more than that. More important was the nation building and the social cohesion that we achieved. We felt proudly South African and simply African. More tourists visited South Africa during the World Cup than during the entire previous year. The final game was watched on television by 909 million people, and at least 60,000 jobs were created in construction alone. Many Americans, especially those willing to travel abroad, gained a much more positive view of South Africa as a result of the World Cup. But this was hardly the full story. Later investigations revealed that South Africa had won the right to host the World Cup, in part because they paid a $10 million bribe to FIFA Vice President Jack Warner. The construction companies tasked with building the new stadiums often received extraordinary lucrative contracts, so much so that they were investigated by competition authorities. Powerful South African politicians, like Tokyo Sexwell, held shares in these construction firms. And it created suspicion that the rich and well-connected were using the public funds set aside for the World Cup to make massive personal profits. In contrast, most ordinary South Africans were unable to attend any games because of the steep ticket prices. The power of FIFA, this global organization that governs football across the world, infused every aspect of the World Cup. For example, one example was Cape Town's iconic stadium, which is right here in beautiful Cape Town. Originally, the municipal government wanted to build one in Athlone on the Cape Flats. That's this area over here. This was a poorer neighborhood where most of Cape Town's soccer fans lived. The hope was a stadium at that site would be sustainable after the World Cup. Spectators left because the fans could easily after the World Cup. Spectators left because the fans could easily attend the matches of their local clubs. But FIFA insisted that the Rand 4.5 billion USD $600 million stadium be constructed in the city center, as it eventually was. Thanks to the Byzantine host country agreement signed by South Africa, FIFA enjoyed almost complete legal authority over all aspects of the World Cup, even if the elected government happened to object. Ultimately, the stadium was built in the Swiss Green Point neighborhood, which is here, ideal for affluent international visitors, but far from the homes of Cape Town's local soccer fans. Unsurprisingly, it became a white elephant, costing the city a lot of money, 45 million euros annually to maintain, money that would be better spent on crippling water shortages and limited infrastructure in the Cape Flats. Many residents simply want to tear it down. FIFA also used its power to ensure its corporate partners were kept happy. South Africa's informal street merchants, so important to the local economy, were banned from operating close to World Cup sites. Only Budweiser, a major American company, was served at the stadiums, despite the company lacking sufficient capacity in the region to keep up with demand. The atmosphere was so corporate that 2 observers felt South Africa had transitioned from the Rainbow Nation to the Rainbow Nation Incorporated. Even the Vuvuzela, these horns here, the most distinctive symbol of the 2010 World Cup, was given an invented African history and used to brand the event. With most of the participants coming from abroad, there was little distinctively South African about the World Cup. Even the World Cup song that kind of took over the world for a time, Shakira's Waka Waka, while it was created in partnership with a South African pop group, it was done by a Colombian pop star. So is this an African thing? Is it a South African thing? Or is it a global thing? And is that bad? Or is that good? Here is a plane that was used to tour the FIFA World Cup trophy around, and it is, of course, sponsored by our good friends over at Coca-Cola. The leaders of South Africa embraced the World Cup for a variety of reasons. In part, they wanted to show that South Africa had become one of the world's leading nations. They also wanted to use the Games to encourage national unity, despite lingering tensions from the apartheid era. Sadly, the World Cup revealed the persistent inequality between South African whites and people of color. After almost £308 million was spent renovating the nearby FNB Stadium, residents of the nearby black township of Riverlea organized a series of violent protests. Touching on a major problem in post-apartheid South Africa, they observed that if the government was able to find money to pay for the World Cup, quote, why are they not pouring money into good housing? Poor South Africans rarely received any direct benefits from the event, but the authorities did make sure they stayed out of sight. One shameful example of this took place in Cape Town, where the urban poor were taken to a newly constructed tin can camp called Bleekesdorp on the edge of the city, far from tourists' prying eyes. As we can see in this shanty town created. They got electricity, though, I guess. Desperate poverty led to the scapegoating of South Africa's immigrant population, and rumors spread that after the World Cup, they would be forcibly deported. Attacks in 2008 had left 62 migrants dead and 100,000 displaced, so many lived in fear throughout the event. Ultimately, the rumored violence did not occur, but the tense atmosphere led one commentator to write the following, quote, yet one cannot help but wonder what the impact on xenophobic resentments and ultimately on the violence itself might have been if even a small percentage of the 40 billion rand spent on World Cup stadiums, new and upgraded airports, roads, and fan parks had instead been used to improve basic services, such as schools, hospitals, and housing, and to create sustainable jobs for the country's poorest. It might have meant a significantly less comfortable stay for our fly-by football guests, but would also certainly have ensured a better situation for our most vulnerable African nationals, as well as for the poor South African majority, who have turned such nationals into scapegoats for their socioeconomic discontent. This is an excellent summary, not only of the consequences of the 2010 World Cup, but also of integrating into the global economy as well. On the one hand, South Africa earned plaudits from around the world for successfully hosting the event, and elite South Africans could look back on this as a moment when the nation came together to welcome the world. On the other, it came at an immense cost, especially to the most vulnerable. Not only were resources diverted away from projects that might have alleviated South Africa's immense income gap between white and black, but cities continue to bear responsibility for maintaining these immense stadiums that will never turn a profit. Conclusion. In this chapter, we've looked at several starkly different interpretations of globalization, all through the lens of soccer. What do they tell us about how historians interpret this critical historical event? First, those who believe in the power of the free market tend to argue that if it is unleashed by globalization, it will reshape society in more rational ways. Historians are usually more skeptical. Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, in particular, suggests that core economies use their power to exploit peripheries, a process that can be seen in the labor politics of globalized soccer. For instance, all the best soccer leagues, they're in Europe. One can even see aspects of Barber's theory at play during the 2010 World Cup, where the elected officials in Cape Town were overruled by an elaborate legal agreement concocted by FIFA, an international organization. Globalization is not solely a force for good. So, globalization, good, bad? What does soccer have to say about it? Thanks for listening. Have a good one.